welcome to tonight's sleep story. Let's drift into a soothing story together as you begin your journey into a restful and rejuvenating sleep. The Emperor stood before the grand mirror, his reflection slowly coming into view as the light from the rising sun filtered softly through the window. He was not a man prone to introspection, yet in this quiet moment he found himself lost in his own gaze. His regal attire, woven with gold threads and studded with precious gems, shimmered as he shifted slightly, admiring the delicate patterns of the fabric. The colors seemed to glow under the light, and the delicate designs on his cloak sparkled like the stars in the midnight sky. The Emperor ran his fingers lightly across the fabric, his eyes tracing every intricate detail, every stitch, as if the clothes themselves were the very embodiment of his power, his glory. But as he stood there, something peculiar began to happen. The vibrant colors of his magnificent robe seemed to fade. He blinked once, and then again, but when he looked back at his reflection, it was as if the richness of his clothes had vanished, replaced by the pale, empty skin beneath. His fine silks, his lavish crown, and the elegant ornaments he had chosen with such care had all disappeared. The Emperor gasped, taking a step closer to the mirror, his breath caught in his throat. He was standing before the mirror, but his image appeared naked, utterly exposed. The glittering fabrics that had once seemed to define him, to amplify his sense of importance, were gone. The shock was so sudden and overwhelming that he could not comprehend it at first. His heart raced and his fingers trembled as he reached out to touch the mirror, as though that might restore the image of his magnificent clothes. But when he pulled his hand back, the emptiness remained, a stark contrast to the finery he was so accustomed to seeing. His pulse quickened, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. How could this be? Was it a trick of the light? Had the mirror been altered in some way? He moved closer, examining every detail of his reflection with frantic intensity. He twirled, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but still, nothing. There was no grand cloak, no jeweled crown, no luxurious garments. There was only him, stripped of all the adornments he had come to depend on. For a moment, panic bubbled up inside him. His mind raced with thoughts of what this could mean. Was he so lost in his vanity that he had overlooked something so simple, so crucial? His entire identity, built upon the image of grandeur, now seemed to evaporate in the harsh light of this shocking truth. Who was he without his clothes, without the exterior that defined him as the Emperor, the ruler of all? He straightened himself, forcing a breath to steady his shaking hands. "It must be the mirror," he muttered to himself. "There must be something wrong with it. It's not possible for me to be without my clothes. I am the Emperor." The Emperor stepped back, attempting to regain his composure, but his mind raced. His clothes, his appearance, his image were the foundations of his rule, his power, his very existence in the eyes of his subjects. He could not, would not be seen like this. He had always prided himself on his attire, on how he presented himself to the world. He had made sure to surround himself with the finest tailors, the most exquisite fabrics, the most dazzling accessories. And now it all seemed to have disappeared into thin air. The thought of presenting himself to the court in such a manner, without his fine clothes, was unthinkable. What would his ministers say? What would the people think? He was supposed to be a symbol of grandeur, a living legend of magnificence and strength, but in this moment he was reduced to nothing. But then, just as quickly as the panic had risen, the Emperor's vanity reasserted itself. He would not allow anyone to see him like this. His mind began to work furiously, coming up with solutions, ways to restore his image before it could be exposed to the public eye. He had a kingdom to rule, and he needed to maintain the image of invincibility that had taken him so far. He was the Emperor, after all. And then, as if answering his silent cry for help, a knock at the door broke his thoughts. A voice called from the other side, "Your Majesty, 2 weavers have arrived to present you with a special gift." The Emperor's heart skipped a beat. "Gift?" he muttered to himself, wiping his brow and adjusting his posture. This was his chance. Perhaps these weavers had something magical that could restore his image, that could fix the strange, unsettling disappearance of his clothes. A gift, something new, something magnificent. He quickly composed himself, pushing aside the panic, replacing it with the confidence of his station. The Emperor was no fool. He knew how to handle these things. He would not let a trivial thing like an empty reflection define him. He was the Emperor, and the world would see him as such. With a deep breath, he called to the servant at the door. "Bring them in," he commanded, his voice now steady, his mind already racing with the possibilities. The Emperor's mind was racing as he turned from the mirror, seeking something, anything to restore his confidence, his image. The words of the servant still echoed in his mind. 2 weavers have arrived with a special gift. He had to act quickly. His reputation, his entire identity, was on the line. He could not appear before his court, before his people, in the state he found himself now. His status, built so meticulously over the years, could crumble in an instant. As he walked to the door, his thoughts were already spinning. Could this gift be the answer? Could these weavers provide him with the solution to this most pressing problem? He had heard rumors of magical garments, clothes woven with threads so fine they seemed almost ethereal, garments that could make a man more powerful, more admirable than ever before. Perhaps these weavers were skilled in such work. Perhaps they had something that could restore him to the greatness he had so carefully cultivated. The door creaked open, and 2 men entered, each carrying a bundle of cloth. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, inspecting them as they bowed low before him. They were not impressive in their appearance, ordinary, even shabby clothes, but there was a certain glimmer in their eyes, a spark of confidence that made the Emperor pause. They spoke with a certain confidence too, and the Emperor, eager to find an answer to his problem, focused on their words. "Your Majesty," one of the weavers said, bowing deeply, "we bring you a gift like no other, a fabric so fine, so beautiful, it is invisible to the unworthy, the foolish, and the ignorant. Only those who possess true wisdom can see the beauty of this cloth." The Emperor's eyes widened slightly. His curiosity piqued. He had heard whispers of such things before, garments so magnificent that they could reveal the true worth of a person. The Emperor, who had always placed such stock in appearances, was intrigued. "Invisible?" he asked, his voice soft with both disbelief and fascination. "And only those who are wise can see it?" "Yes, Your Majesty," the second weaver replied, nodding earnestly. "It is the finest cloth you can imagine. Only the truly wise will perceive its beauty, while the foolish, those who are not fit for their position, will see nothing at all." The Emperor's heart raced. His vanity, which had once been his greatest asset, was now his greatest vulnerability. He was terrified at the thought of being seen as foolish, of being called out by his subjects as someone who could not even appreciate the most exquisite clothes. He could not afford to look ignorant in front of the kingdom. To be seen as foolish would be the ultimate disgrace. He quickly suppressed his doubts. This was the solution he had been waiting for. "Prepare the fabric," he commanded. "I will wear these magnificent clothes at once, have them made, and bring them to me for my parade tomorrow." The weavers exchanged knowing glances, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of their mouths. "Of course, Your Majesty," they said in unison, bowing deeply before leaving to begin their work. Once they were gone, the Emperor allowed himself a moment to breathe a sigh of relief. He had made the right decision. He had secured the most magnificent clothes, ones that would elevate him further above his people. In his mind, he could already picture the grand procession, the admiration of his people as he walked through the streets in his stunning new attire. But as he stood there waiting for the weavers to complete their work, something stirred in his chest. A tiny seed of doubt, though he quickly dismissed it. The idea that the clothes might truly be invisible to those who were unworthy was almost too absurd to consider. But still the Emperor could not risk the possibility that he might be seen as unfit for his position. He would have to act as though the clothes were indeed real, whether he could see them or not. The day had arrived, the Emperor's grand procession, the moment he had been eagerly anticipating. The city was abuzz with excitement, the streets lined with citizens eager to catch a glimpse of their ruler in his magnificent new clothes. Banners fluttered in the wind, and the air was thick with the fragrance of freshly bloomed flowers, a celebratory atmosphere filling every corner of the kingdom. But amidst the festivities there was an undercurrent of tension. The Emperor's mind raced with thoughts of the invisible clothes, the clothes that only the wise could. As the Emperor stood before the full-length mirror, His reflection still appeared to be empty, but he dared not question it. He had to maintain the illusion at all costs. He reached out to touch the fabric of his new clothes, his hands brushing against nothingness, but he told himself it was just too fine to feel. The most exquisite cloth, so delicate and ethereal that only the truly intelligent would be able to perceive it. The Emperor stood in front of his mirror, adorned with nothing but his confidence. He had spent hours preparing for the parade, his mind consumed with thoughts of how he would appear to his subjects. The weavers had assured him that he would look magnificent, and though he could see no clothes, he forced himself to believe in their words. His vanity told him that to question the reality of the clothes would be to question his own authority, his own wisdom, and so he did not question them. "Your Majesty, the procession is ready," came the voice of his chief minister, breaking the Emperor's reverie. "The people await your presence." The Emperor took a deep breath, straightened his back, and walked out into the hallway. His steps measured and deliberate. He could hear the excited chatter of the courtiers and the rustling of the royal robes he was supposed to be wearing. He had a moment's doubt, but it passed as quickly as it came. He was the Emperor after all. He had nothing to fear. He was dressed in the finest clothes the kingdom had ever seen, even if no one could actually see them. As he made his way to the grand entrance, the streets of the capital lay before him, the crowds cheering with anticipation. The Emperor emerged, stepping onto the balcony where he was to be seen by his people. The entire kingdom had gathered to witness his grandeur, to witness the Emperor who was beyond compare. The moment he stepped forward, the crowd erupted in applause. The Emperor waved to his subjects, his face radiant with the satisfaction of his own perceived magnificence. The people cheered loudly, their voices ringing in the air, but their eyes, wide with either awe or confusion, reflected something different. No one dared to speak the truth. They had all heard the rumors. They knew that the Emperor was wearing nothing but air, but each of them too feared being seen as foolish or unfit for their position, and so they followed the Emperor's lead, praising him as if his invisible clothes were indeed the finest in the land. "What magnificent garments!" a minister cried, his voice filled with exaggerated admiration. "A perfect fit for such a wise and beautiful ruler." "How splendid!" a noblewoman said, her eyes wide with fake awe. "The Emperor's taste is unrivaled. Truly no one has ever worn such exquisite clothes before." The Emperor beamed with pride, nodding in approval as the flattery continued. He strutted down the path, his chest puffed out, reveling in the praise of the people. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him, their admiration, their respect, but inside, a quiet doubt still lingered, like a whisper in the back of his mind. What if they could see that he was not wearing anything at all? What if they had figured out the truth? But he quickly pushed the thought away. No one would dare to speak against him. No one would dare to call him foolish. The procession continued through the streets, the Emperor's confidence growing with each passing moment. The people lined the streets cheering, clapping, and singing the Emperor's praises, but there was a palpable tension in the air. The Emperor's delusion was so strong, so unshakable, that he could not see the truth. He had become a figure trapped in his own vanity, living a lie so grand that even he believed it. As the parade reached the town square, the crowd grew even larger. The Emperor, now at the height of his illusion, stopped in front of a large platform where he turned to face his people, ready to bask in their admiration. But in the midst of his triumph, a small voice, innocent and untainted by the fear that gripped the adults, broke through the false praise. "But the Emperor has nothing on," the child shouted from the crowd, pointing directly at the Emperor. For a brief moment the world seemed to freeze. The Emperor's smile faltered. His heart skipped a beat. A child, innocent and unaware of the consequences of their words, had spoken the truth, and it was a truth that no one else dared to utter. The crowd fell silent, and the Emperor felt the weight of the moment settle over him. His heart raced as he turned to look at the courtiers and ministers, but their faces were masked with fear, each of them too afraid to admit the truth. Their eyes avoided his, unwilling to speak out loud what they knew to be true. The Emperor, still caught in his delusion, straightened his back and forced a smile. He turned and continued walking, determined to maintain the illusion that he was still magnificent, still the Emperor everyone adored. Even though the truth had been spoken, He would not allow it to be his downfall. "The procession continues," the emperor cried out, raising his chin high as he marched forward. "I am the emperor, and nothing can change that." The crowd, now uneasy, followed behind, still caught in the sway of the emperor's confidence. But there was a shift in the air. The truth had been revealed, and yet the emperor, stubborn in his pride, refused to acknowledge it. He marched forward, his head held high, even as the silence of his deception lingered. The parade had moved through the streets, the crowd still clapping and shouting, but there was a new layer to the atmosphere, an uneasy tension, a quiet that clung to the air like a fog. The emperor, blissfully unaware, continued his procession, walking with the same proud steps, his head high as ever. He heard the applause, felt the eyes of his subjects on him, but in the pit of his stomach a small nagging doubt had begun to grow. The streets seemed endless, stretching out in a procession that was as much a triumph as it was a farce. The sound of the crowd's adulation mixed with the soft whisper of the wind, the flutter of the flags, and the distant sounds of the marketplace. Everything felt perfect, or at least it should have. For the emperor, the grand spectacle of his new clothes was meant to be the climax of his reign, his triumph over all who had doubted his greatness. But beneath the surface of the festivities, the weight of the truth lingered, silent, pressing against his chest. As the emperor walked, his eyes flickered over the crowd, searching for signs of admiration. But something felt wrong. The faces around him, though still smiling and clapping, seemed almost too wide, too strained. It was as though everyone was trying too hard to make him believe that the invisible clothes were real. But how long could this pretense go on? He looked ahead, trying to push aside his discomfort. The grand procession was nearing the town square, the final stop before he would make his grand speech, delivering a message of prosperity and glory to his people. The emperor felt a surge of confidence. "This is my moment," he thought to himself. "Nothing will spoil it. I am the emperor, and they will bow before me." Then, as if to shatter the illusion, the voice of a child, bright, innocent, and clear, broke through the din of the crowd. "But the emperor has nothing on." The words rang out with the simplicity of a truth too pure to ignore. The crowd stilled. The emperor froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the weight of the words sinking into the space between him and the people. The child's voice, free from the fear that held everyone else in silence, shattered the bubble of lies that had surrounded the emperor. The truth had been spoken aloud. There were no magnificent clothes. There was nothing but a man standing there in his nakedness, a fragile emperor who had fooled himself into believing that the world could be deceived along with him. For a long moment there was complete silence. The emperor's face flushed with embarrassment, but he quickly masked it with a forced smile. He looked at the crowd, expecting them to react. "Surely they will still follow me," he thought, his pride swelling as he tried to maintain his composure. The people around him hesitated. Some shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to one another. Others, caught in the fear of being seen as foolish, continued to clap and cheer, their applause now more mechanical than genuine. The emperor's eyes searched their faces, desperate for confirmation that his illusion was still intact, that his grandiosity had not been undone by a child's innocent observation. But the truth had been spoken, and now it lingered in the air, impossible to dismiss. The emperor took a slow step forward, trying to regain control of the moment. His mind raced. What do I do now? Should he stop? Should he acknowledge the truth? No, he could not. He had to continue. To stop now would be to admit that he had been fooled, that his entire sense of power was built on an illusion. And so, with a deep breath, he straightened his back and pushed forward, raising his chin higher, his steps more deliberate, his eyes looking straight ahead. "The procession must continue," he shouted, his voice rising over the crowd, as if to drown out the truth. "There is nothing wrong with my clothes. I am the emperor, and I am perfect in every way." The emperor's defiance was met with a strange silence from the crowd. Some clapped hesitantly, others whispered amongst themselves, but all of them followed the emperor's lead, as if in a trance, too afraid to challenge the illusion. No one dared to speak the truth aloud, even though it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The emperor continued walking, his steps now mechanical, forced. The once proud procession had become a hollow march, a parade of emptiness as the emperor pushed forward, refusing to acknowledge the truth, refusing to accept that the whole world could see him as he truly was. But the more the emperor tried to convince himself, the harder it became to ignore the fact that he had been exposed. The weight of his vanity, once so firm and unshakable, now seemed fragile, as if it might collapse at any moment. Yet still he walked on, determined to preserve the image of greatness that he had so carefully crafted. The emperor continued his procession, his steps steady yet laden with an overwhelming sense of denial. Each footfall echoed in the silence of the street, mingling with the faint sound of hesitant applause. The people around him, his ministers, his advisors, the common folk, seemed caught in a strange limbo. They moved, they clapped, but the energy in the air had shifted. The truth had been spoken by the child, and now it lingered like an unseen cloud, casting a shadow over the emperor's illusion. The emperor, though, would not break. He would not give in to the truth. His pride, so deeply rooted in his appearance and the facade of grandeur, demanded that he continue. To stop now would be to admit his foolishness, to acknowledge that everything he had believed was built on nothing more than empty praise and deceit. He could not bear it. "I am the emperor," he thought. "I have the right to appear as I choose. No one can see through me." The crowd followed him, though some of their steps seemed uncertain. Their faces, once filled with awe, were now marked by confusion and hesitation. They whispered among themselves, casting furtive glances at one another, their praise now less enthusiastic, less genuine. But the emperor, oblivious, marched forward, his eyes fixed on the horizon, unwilling to see the disillusionment unfolding around him. As they reached the town square, the emperor paused. The grand palace loomed ahead, and the moment felt monumental. It was here, in this space, that the emperor would present himself as the embodiment of perfection. He would give his speech, and he would remind his people that he was above reproach, that his worth was unquestionable, but deep within there was a tremor of doubt, a quiet whisper telling him that something had changed, something had been lost, yet he refused to listen. The square was filled with people, gathered to witness the emperor's grandeur. They stood in lines, watching in eager anticipation as he made his way to the platform. The sound of their clapping felt muted now, as though the truth had sapped the energy from their applause. Still they cheered, for they dared not do otherwise. Fear of being labelled foolish, of being singled out for their honesty, gripped them. The emperor took his place at the podium, his heart pounding, but he maintained his regal composure. He raised his arms to silence the crowd, waiting for the moment when he would speak. But as he stood there, bathed in the weak light of the afternoon sun, something unsettling happened. The air seemed to grow thick, and the weight of the invisible clothes, the very clothes that he had believed were the key to his power, felt unbearably heavy. It wasn't the weight of gold or silk, but the weight of the illusion that had been built up around him. The realization struck him like a wave crashing on the shore. Despite the applause, despite the cheers, he was still standing there bare. His voice faltered slightly as he began his speech, but he quickly regained his composure. "My people," he said, his voice carrying with the authority he had always known, "I stand before you today, dressed in the finest garments that anyone could ever imagine. You have seen them, you have admired them, for this is a moment of great pride for our kingdom." There was a pause, and the emperor looked out at the crowd, expecting the usual flurry of admiration. But all he saw were 1,000 eyes that did not meet his, eyes filled with doubt and uncertainty. His heart skipped a beat. Were they mocking him? Were they seeing the truth? No, he thought. They can't be. They must be afraid to speak. They must be afraid of being foolish. The emperor pushed forward, speaking faster now, trying to control the rising panic within him. "These clothes, woven by the finest weavers in the land, are a symbol of our prosperity, our wisdom. Let no one say that our kingdom is not blessed." His words, though loud and proud, fell flat in the air. The emperor could feel it now, the distance between him and his people. He could sense the unease in their silence, their inability to speak the truth, their fear of being perceived as foolish. But the deeper truth was that the emperor himself felt foolish. his heart heavy with the burden of maintaining a lie that had long since become unsustainable. And then, once again, the child's words echoed in his mind, louder than any cheer or praise. "The Emperor has nothing on." The simplicity of the statement, the innocence in the voice, became a mirror reflecting the Emperor's inner reality. The truth was undeniable now. The Emperor stood alone in the square, stripped of his illusion, his nakedness exposed for all to see. But even in the face of this crushing realization, the Emperor did not stop. He could not. He refused to acknowledge the truth, and instead he forced himself to smile, to continue the charade. He had come too far, built too much on his image to back down now. His pride, like the invisible clothes, was all that was left. As the procession continued, the Emperor marched forward, not knowing how much further he could go. His body ached from the weight of his own delusion, but his steps remained firm. The crowd followed behind him, but there was no joy in their movement. They were simply going through the motions, afraid to break the silence, afraid to speak the truth. The Emperor's procession continued, but the streets that once felt filled with admiration and awe now felt eerily silent. The hum of the crowd, once brimming with cheers, now seemed like distant echoes, soft and hesitant. The Emperor marched, his head high, shoulders squared, eyes forward, his heart desperately trying to drown out the undeniable truth that had broken through the facade. Each step he took was filled with the hollow sound of the invisible clothes beneath him, his body moving as though weighed down by his own pride. The kingdom's streets, which had always been filled with warmth and joy, now seemed to stretch endlessly before him, a never-ending path of discomfort and fear. The people, once so quick to admire his fine attire, now stood in quiet clusters, their eyes downcast, their hands still. The applause, which had once filled the air like a sea of sound, had slowed to awkward claps. No one spoke openly, and the Emperor could feel the weight of their silence like an invisible cloak draped over him. They feared to speak, feared to be the one who broke the illusion. As the Emperor moved along the path, the confusion and doubt among the crowd were palpable. People exchanged glances, unsure whether they should speak the truth, afraid of being thought of as foolish. The Emperor, oblivious to this, continued to walk forward, his steps growing more robotic, his confidence more fragile. His eyes flickered from face to face, searching for that familiar admiration, but it was absent. No one dared to confront him, but neither did they praise him as they once had. Their eyes, though polite, no longer held the same warmth. They were filled with uncertainty, confusion, and a lingering pity. The Emperor reached the heart of the town square, where the grand palace loomed ahead, its gates wide open for the final leg of the parade. The light from the setting sun bathed the palace in a golden hue, casting long shadows that seemed to deepen the silence around him. The Emperor turned toward the steps leading to the palace, his heart thumping louder with each step. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far, built too much to turn back. "I must maintain my dignity," he muttered under his breath. "I am the Emperor. I am the ruler of all. This is not how it ends." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the deepening cracks in his self-assurance, but he forced himself to ignore it. He would not be the one to admit the truth. He would not be the one to fall. The truth, he decided, was something to be hidden, something to be concealed beneath the layers of his arrogance, and he would keep walking until the end. Behind him, the ministers and courtiers followed in silence, their faces pale, their steps unsure. Their once proud parade had become a quiet march, each person trapped in the same delicate dance of pretending not to see the Emperor's nakedness. No one dared to speak. They were bound by the same fear that had always controlled them, fear of being thought foolish. The silence was suffocating, but they too walked forward, compelled by the same force that pushed the Emperor. As the procession continued, the Emperor passed through the grand gates of the palace, his eyes fixed on the open hall, the grand staircase leading up to the throne room. But as he stepped through the threshold, his body suddenly faltered, and for a fleeting moment he felt something shift inside him, a soft voice of realization that he could no longer ignore. What have I done? His heart, for just a moment, betrayed him, and he felt the weight of his pride press down on him, heavier than the robes that weren't even there. It was then that a faint voice in the distance broke through the oppressive silence. It was a small child standing at the very back of the crowd, no more than a few feet from the emperor's path. The child's voice rang out clearly, unafraid and unaffected by the weight of fear that clung to the adults around them. "But the emperor is wearing nothing." The words were simple, pure, and untainted by the fear of what others would think. They rang through the air like a bell, cutting through the tension, breaking the quiet murmur of the crowd. The emperor froze in place. The child's observations, so innocent, so blunt, carried the weight of truth with it, and in that instant the entire world seemed to stop. The emperor's heart skipped a beat. The world around him seemed to close in. The silence that followed felt suffocating. He wanted to shout, to deny it, to say anything that would save his pride. But all he could hear was the faint echo of the child's words, the truth that had been spoken aloud for the first time. For a long moment the emperor stood frozen, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like a physical force. His eyes searched the crowd, but no one met his gaze. The ministers, the courtiers, the nobles, each of them too afraid to speak, too afraid to challenge the lie they had all lived by. They kept their eyes on the ground, some even continuing to clap, but their applause felt hollow, fake. And then, in a voice that seemed far too soft for a man of such power, the emperor whispered, "I am not a fool." It was a desperate cry for reassurance, a plea to silence the truth that echoed in the air. But it was too late. The emperor had crossed a point of no return. The silence now carried the weight of everything he had failed to acknowledge, the truth he had hidden behind his vanity, and the illusion he had built for so long. The grand image he had built up, his illusion of grandeur, lay in tatters, exposed by the voice of a child who saw through the falsehood. With a stiff neck, the emperor continued his walk, though it was no longer the confident stride of a ruler. His steps were heavy, his pace slow. He had not stopped the parade, but inside his heart was crumbling. The emperor, for the first time, felt the full weight of his own emptiness. And so the procession continued, but now it was no longer a triumph. It was a quiet march of defiance, a defiance that came not from strength, but from a pride too great to admit the truth. The emperor's reality had shattered, but his journey had only just begun. The emperor continued his procession, though every step felt like an eternity. His once proud stride was now heavy, each movement deliberate yet frail. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief, but beneath it all, there remained one unshakable truth. He could not, would not, stop. The emperor, trapped by his vanity and pride, pushed forward, ignoring the truth that the child had so innocently spoken. The fabric of his power, which had once seemed so secure, had unraveled in an instant, but he was determined to keep the illusion alive. He was determined to show the world, show himself, that he was still the emperor. As he walked through the palace gates, the weight of the truth seemed to press against him more heavily. The crowd, once filled with enthusiastic applause, now felt distant, like a mere backdrop to his own internal struggle. Their clapping had lost its rhythm, their cheers had lost their vigor. The emperor tried not to notice, focusing instead on the path ahead. He had to keep his composure. The wedding ceremony was still a few hours away, and he would stand before his people once more, in full display of his supposed grandeur. The ministers and courtiers who had been walking behind him fell into a nervous silence. They too were afraid to speak, afraid of drawing attention to the truth that the emperor could no longer deny. They walked behind him, heads down, eyes averted, their minds clouded with fear of being labeled as fools for seeing the reality no one dared acknowledge. The emperor had led them into this illusion, and now they were trapped in it too. The truth had been laid bare, but they would continue to follow him, pretending, as they always had, that nothing had changed. As they entered the grand hall, the emperor's mind raced with the preparations for his final appearance. The room was decorated with magnificent tapestries, sparkling chandeliers, and golden accents that shimmered in the soft light. The guests were already gathering for the ceremony, the rich and powerful, the elite of the kingdom, all seated in eager anticipation. But the emperor's gaze no longer seemed to catch their attention. His eyes flickered around the room, his senses dulled by the gnawing emptiness inside him. The wedding ceremony loomed just ahead, and he was expected to stand as a symbol of greatness, a figurehead for the glory of the kingdom. But in this moment, the emperor understood something that had eluded him for so long. His grandeur, the image he had built for himself, was hollow. It had always been hollow. What was a king without his clothes? What was an emperor without the truth? For a brief moment, the emperor allowed himself to pause. The sound of the wedding preparations faded into the background as he stood still, his mind heavy with realization. His vanity, his obsession with appearances, had led him down this path, and now, as he stood before the mirror of his kingdom, he saw himself for what he truly was. A man whose power had always rested on the illusion of greatness, an emperor whose real strength was nothing more than the facade he had so carefully crafted. The truth, like a wave crashing against the shore, was overwhelming, but the emperor still refused to let it in. I cannot stop now, he thought. I cannot let them see me fall. I am the emperor. I have built this empire, this image. I will finish what I started. He turned, facing the throne that awaited him, the seat of his power, the symbol of his rule. The emperor's heart beat faster. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to leave the kingdom, to disappear into the sea like the waves crashing against the rocks. But his pride kept him standing tall, kept him moving forward. His kingdom, his subjects, they still needed him, didn't they? Without him, who would they follow? The emperor couldn't bear the thought of being forgotten, of being seen as weak, of being seen for what he truly was, a man with nothing but an image to hold on to. As he stepped onto the grand platform, the guests rose in a wave of applause. Though the clapping was more hesitant than it had been before, the emperor stood tall, his face composed, but inside he was shaken. This is it, he thought. The final moment. I have to finish the performance. I have to be who they expect me to be. The emperor's voice rang out strong and commanding as he began to speak. My people, today marks a momentous occasion, a day that will go down in history. The kingdom is flourishing, and our prosperity knows no bounds. I stand before you in the finest of garments, woven with the finest threads, crafted by the most skilled of hands. His words, though proud, felt hollow in his own mouth. Each syllable seemed to echo in the vast hall, bouncing off the walls, but the truth that he had denied was still there, still lurking beneath the surface. The emperor's hands, once so steady and sure, now trembled slightly as he raised them in triumph. The applause continued, though it felt more mechanical, more forced. The emperor's eyes scanned the room, catching the eyes of his ministers, his courtiers, the nobles, all of them following along, all of them pretending that nothing had changed. He had become a puppet, trapped in his own creation. But despite the false adulation, despite the charade, the emperor couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that clung to him. He had fooled the kingdom, but he had not fooled himself. The truth was unavoidable now. His magnificence, his grandeur, it had been a lie from the start. The emperor stood before his throne, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. He had reached the peak of his power, but at what cost? What was the price of vanity? What was the cost of building an empire on lies? For a brief moment he thought he might speak the truth, admit the reality to his people, but the words died on his lips. He couldn't do it. The emperor's pride was too great, too firmly entrenched to allow for such a revelation. And so he stood there, alone on his throne, trapped in his own illusion, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth he could never fully face. The emperor sat upon his throne, surrounded by the remnants of his grand procession. The room was quiet now, save for the occasional murmur of his ministers, who spoke in hushed tones, their eyes often glancing away from him as though they feared to meet his gaze. The grand hall was still draped with the banners of wealth and power, the opulence of the event still hanging in the air, but the emperor no longer felt the pride that once swelled in his chest. Instead, there was an unsettling emptiness, a hollow echo of the grandeur that had once seemed so real. The emperor looked out over the crowd of courtiers, advisors, and nobles, but none of them met his eyes. They continued to speak in whispers, their words mingling with the soft hum of the room. The emperor could feel the weight of their silence pressing on him. They were afraid to speak the truth, afraid to acknowledge what had been made so painfully clear. It wasn't just the child's words that lingered in his mind. It was the way the crowd had reacted, how they had pretended, how they had been complicit in his lie. They had cheered for him, applauded him, even though they all knew the truth that he was standing there, in the eyes of his people, completely exposed, and yet they had continued to praise him. They had participated in the illusion, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps because they too were afraid to confront the reality that had been so plainly laid bare. The Emperor felt an intense sadness wash over him. He had built his identity on the lies that others had helped him create, and now he saw them for what they truly were, nothing more than fragile illusions. His pride had driven him to create a world that revolved around his image, his appearance, and his power. But now there was nothing left of that world. The Emperor, who had once believed he was invincible, was now standing on the precipice of his own downfall. The Emperor rose slowly from his throne, his eyes scanning the room, the faces of his subjects no longer full of awe, but filled with uncertainty. He walked to the large window that overlooked the city, where the streets that had once cheered for him now seemed distant and empty. The light of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the Emperor did not feel its warmth. His mind was far from the beauty of the view, far from the kingdom he had spent his life building. "What have I become?" he whispered to himself. His voice was barely audible, but the words carried the weight of everything he had lost. He had traded his soul for grandeur, his true self for an illusion. The mirror had shown him his nakedness, but the truth had been there all along. He had been exposed long before the child spoke those fateful words. His clothes had never mattered. It was his vanity, his pride, his need for external validation that had left him bare. As the Emperor stood there, lost in his own reflection, he could not shake the image of the child's innocent face, the child who had seen through the charade. The child had no fear, no hesitation in calling out the truth, and in doing so had shattered the Emperor's world. It was as though the Emperor's own eyes had been opened, the curtain lifted, and he was finally forced to confront the reality he had been so carefully avoiding. But even as the weight of his choices settled upon him, the Emperor's pride refused to die. He couldn't admit defeat. He couldn't allow the truth to win. "I am the Emperor," he thought again, though this time the words felt empty. "I have the right to rule. I have the right to command respect." Yet, deep down, he knew that respect had never been earned. It had been built on lies, on appearances, on the fear of those too afraid to speak the truth. With a heavy heart, the Emperor turned away from the window and walked back to his throne. He sat down slowly, feeling the weight of his own delusion crushing him. The silence in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. The Emperor looked at his ministers, his courtiers, his subjects, and for the first time, he truly saw them. They were not the adoring fans he had imagined them to be. They were not his loyal followers. They were just people, as lost as he was, trapped in a world that valued nothing but appearances. The Emperor's eyes lingered on the crowd, but he could not bring himself to speak. Words felt hollow now, meaningless. He had no grand proclamations to make, no speeches to deliver. There was no point in pretending any longer. The Emperor had come to realize that the clothes, the crown, the empire, all of it had been a facade, a distraction from the emptiness he had been hiding from. In the quiet of the room, as the golden light of the sun began to fade, the Emperor understood. He had been searching for something his entire life, a validation, a sense of worth, a purpose. But all along, it had been within him. The love of his people, the respect of his kingdom. It had never come from what he wore or how he appeared. It came from the truth, it came from the heart. And now, as the final pieces of his illusion crumbled away, he was left with nothing but the painful reality of his own choices. But even as he faced the bitter truth, the Emperor knew one thing. He could not undo the past. He could not take back the years he had spent chasing an image of greatness. All he had left was the quiet understanding that the world had always seen him for who he truly was, just a man. A man who had spent too long hiding behind a crown and a cloak, and in that moment he made a final decision. He would walk into the world no longer as a ruler of illusions, but as a man willing to face the truth, however painful it might be. The evening had descended upon the kingdom, the last traces of sunlight fading from the sky, replaced by the soft glow of candlelight that flickered through the palace windows. The emperor sat in his throne room, surrounded by the echoes of a world that no longer seemed to make sense. The grandeur of the palace, the lavish tapestries, and the royal insignia that adorned every wall, all of it now seemed so distant, so irrelevant. He'd spent his life collecting symbols of power, but now he saw them as hollow, empty pieces of a puzzle that he could no longer put together. His courtiers had left hours ago, leaving him alone in the vast, echoing room. The silence was oppressive, thick with the weight of the truth he could no longer avoid. The whispers of the child's words still rang in his ears. The emperor has nothing on. That simple truth, so pure in its innocence, had unraveled everything he had built, everything he had worked so hard to uphold. And yet, the emperor could not bring himself to fully embrace it. His pride would not allow him to admit the depth of his own failure, the sheer futility of his obsession with appearances. He stood from the throne slowly, the fabric of his clothes trailing behind him, an invisible weight that pressed upon his shoulders. The emperor took slow, deliberate steps towards the grand mirror that hung across from him, the reflection of the room stretching before him. He had been here before, standing in front of mirrors, admiring his clothes, his form, his face. But now, as he faced the mirror once again, he saw himself as he truly was, not as the Grand Emperor, but as a man exposed, vulnerable, and lost. His reflection stared back at him, a stranger to his own eyes. Who am I without the clothes? He wondered. But the question remained unanswered. He could no longer answer it for himself. The Emperor's identity, once built on his outward image, had crumbled into dust. What was left of him? What remained of the power he had once wielded? The Emperor's heart was heavy with the realization that he had spent his life seeking validation from external sources, his clothes, his position, his titles. But now he had none of that. He was just a man, no different from the peasants in the streets, no different from the children who spoke the truth aloud. The Emperor had always thought himself above them, but in the end, he was just as vulnerable, just as human as anyone else. As the cold night air seeped into the room, the Emperor felt the deep loneliness that had always been with him, but had never been acknowledged. He'd spent so much time surrounded by courtiers, ministers, and admirers, but in the quiet of the palace, in the silence of his own heart, he realized how truly alone he was. The people had never truly seen him, not as he had wanted to be seen. They had only seen the illusion, the image he had carefully crafted. And when that illusion was shattered, they had scattered, leaving him to face the reality of his own empty pride. I have nothing, the Emperor whispered to himself, his voice breaking the stillness. Nothing but this empty shell. For the first time in his life, he truly understood the cost of his vanity. The pursuit of perfection, the obsession with appearance, had left him with nothing real. He had sacrificed his truth, his authenticity, for a crown that was no more than a symbol, for robes that were nothing but fabric and thread. What had he really built after all? What had his title ever truly meant if he could not be seen for who he really was? The weight of his decisions was crushing, but there was no turning back. He had lost everything, the adoration of his people, his dignity, his self-respect. The Emperor could no longer pretend. He could no longer continue to march through the streets, parading an image of greatness that was no more than smoke and mirrors. The reality had set in. His empire, his image, and his life had all been a grand illusion, and now he was left alone, stripped of everything he had once believed gave him meaning. The kingdom he had built on appearances, on vanity, would crumble, and with it, the Emperor's reign would come to its quiet, inevitable end. But as the Emperor stood in front of the mirror, gazing at his own reflection, something shifted within him. Could he live with the truth? Could he face the world without the armor of his illusions? For the first time, he understood that to live authentically, he would have to let go of the empty pride he had clung to for so long. He would have to walk into the world without the veil of his illusions, without the mask of his imagined grandeur. And in doing so, he would have to accept that he was not the emperor he had once believed himself to be. The emperor stood alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of his thoughts pressing heavily on his shoulders. The once grand procession, the applause, the cheers, all of it now felt like a distant echo. He had come so far, built his entire identity on the grand illusion of power and perfection. But, in the stillness of the palace, the truth had become impossible to ignore. The facade he had so carefully constructed had crumbled, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and questioning everything he had ever believed. The room around him felt cold, though the warmth of the setting sun still filtered softly through the palace windows. His throne, once a symbol of unmatched authority, now appeared as nothing more than an empty seat, a hollow reminder of the empire he had lost. The golden accents that adorned the walls, the fine tapestries that hung in the great hall, none of it mattered anymore. The emperor could not find solace in these outward symbols of wealth and power. All that was left was the silence, and in it, his own reflection. The child's voice still rang in his ears. "The emperor has nothing on." Those words, so simple, so innocent, had shattered the illusion. What had he really built all these years? What had he been chasing all this time? His pride, his vanity, had led him down a path where the truth was never spoken, where the image of perfection was more important than the reality of his own humanity. He turned from the mirror, his reflection still haunting him. "I am the emperor," he muttered to himself, but even as he said the words, they felt hollow. I was the emperor. The distinction was subtle but profound. The emperor had been someone, but now he was just a man, one who had let his vanity overshadow his humanity, one who had built an empire on the flimsy foundation of empty appearances. The emperor's steps were slow as he moved toward the balcony, his eyes scanning the now empty streets below. The people who had once worshipped him, who had cheered for him, had already moved on. The parade, the wedding, the grand spectacle, they were behind him now. His kingdom, his subjects, his legacy, everything seemed to have evaporated like mist in the morning sun. A deep sense of emptiness settled in his chest, and the cold night air that drifted in through the balcony doors seemed to penetrate his very soul. He had everything, power, wealth, admiration, but none of it had filled the void inside him. His clothes had been nothing but a shield, a way to protect himself from the fear of being ordinary, of being unimportant. But now, in the quiet of his solitude, he realized that it was not the clothes, not the jewels, not the title that made him valuable. It was something deeper, something he had forgotten long ago. For the first time, the emperor understood that he had lost himself in his pursuit of an image, and in doing so, he had alienated the very people who mattered most. The truth was, he had never truly understood what it meant to rule with wisdom, with compassion. He had ruled with vanity, with the illusion of power, and now that illusion had been stripped away. The emperor closed his eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel the pain of his decisions, the consequences of his obsession. "Is this what I wanted?" he wondered aloud, the sound of his voice startling in the silence of the room. To be adored for something that was never real? As the last rays of sunlight faded and the stars began to twinkle softly in the sky, the emperor made a decision. He could not undo the past, he could not change the choices he had made, but perhaps there was still a chance to rebuild, starting with himself. He no longer needed the extravagant clothes or the praise of the people. He needed to find something real, something that came from within. In that moment, the emperor understood that true greatness was not found in the clothes he wore, or the title he held. It was found in the way he treated others, in the honesty with which he governed, in the humility with which he accepted the truth. He had been blinded by vanity, but now he saw clearly. As the emperor walked away from the balcony, a quiet sense of peace began to settle over him. He had faced the truth, and while it was painful, it was also freeing. The emperor had been consumed by the pursuit of perfection, but now he was ready to embrace his own imperfections. The story of his reign, though filled with pride and illusion, would now take a new turn. The emperor had learned that to truly lead, he must first learn to lead himself, to see himself for who he truly was and accept it with all its flaws and beauty. And so, as the night deepened, the emperor made a silent vow. He would no longer wear the cloak of false grandeur. Instead, he would walk among his people as a man, not as a myth, and perhaps in doing so, he would begin to rebuild the trust that had been lost. The emperor, now no longer blinded by vanity, had found a new path, a path not of illusion, but of truth. The moon hung high in the night sky, casting a soft silver light over the kingdom below. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of distant flowers and the faint echo of night birds calling to one another. The emperor sat alone in his chambers, his thoughts a quiet storm inside his mind. The grand palace around him, which had once symbolized his power and pride, now felt like an empty shell. The ornate furniture, the glittering chandeliers, the luxurious tapestries, everything that had once been so important, now seemed irrelevant. He had lived his life surrounded by these symbols of grandeur, but now, in the stillness of the night, he saw them for what they truly were, distractions from the truth of who he was. For the first time in years, the emperor allowed himself to reflect not on his appearance or the grandeur of his kingdom, but on his own heart, on his actions, and on the lessons he had learned. The illusion of his clothes had been shattered, but in its place something deeper was emerging. He had finally learned the truth. The essence of greatness did not lie in titles or material wealth, but in sincerity, humility, and the ability to lead with compassion. The emperor rose from his chair, moving toward the balcony that overlooked the gardens. The wind had picked up, swirling through the trees, and the sound of the leaves rustling created a soft, calming melody. He breathed in deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. It was a simple thing, the feeling of the wind against his skin, but for the first time the emperor truly appreciated it. There were no grand speeches, no dazzling clothes, no expectations. There was only the peace of the present moment, the clarity that came from embracing who he was without the need for pretense. As he stood there looking out over his kingdom, the emperor thought about his people. They had followed him not because of the clothes he wore, but because of the hope they had placed in him. They had believed in the image he had created, but he had failed them. Now he had to rebuild that trust, not with grandeur or false promises, but with authenticity and truth. The emperor turned to face his servants, who had been quietly standing in the shadows, awaiting his next command. They were nervous, hesitant, unsure of what to expect. For so long they had been accustomed to the emperor's demands, to his expectations of perfection. But now the emperor knew that perfection was not what they needed. They needed a leader who could understand their struggles, a leader who could face the truth without fear. He nodded gently toward them. "Gather the court," he said softly, his voice calm and steady, yet filled with a new sense of purpose. "It's time to speak to them, to tell them the truth." The servants exchanged glances, a mix of uncertainty and hope in their eyes. They had never seen the emperor so resolved, so grounded in his own truth, and yet they trusted him. They had seen the shift in him, the change that had taken place since the day of the procession. They could feel the difference in the air, and they understood that this moment, this decision, was the beginning of something new. As the emperor prepared to address the court, he found himself filled with a sense of calm he had never experienced before. His past actions, the choices he had made to protect his image, to live behind a mask of grandeur, now seemed like a distant memory. The emperor knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Rebuilding the trust of his people would take time, and there would be those who would question his ability to lead. But for the first time he felt ready to face those challenges. He would no longer be the emperor of illusions. He would be a ruler who faced the truth, who led with humility and compassion. The court assembled, and the emperor walked before them, standing taller than he had ever been, not because of the robe he wore or the crown on his head, but because of the truth that now lay at the center of his heart. The room fell silent as the emperor began to speak, his words gentle yet firm. his voice carrying the weight of a man who had finally found his place in the world. "My people," the emperor began, his words measured, "I stand before you not as the man I once was, but as someone who has seen the truth. I've spent my life chasing after things that I thought would bring me happiness, things that I thought would make me whole. But in the end, I found that it is not the clothes we wear or the titles we hold that define us. It is the way we treat one another, the way we lead with honesty, humility, and love. I have failed you, and for that I am truly sorry. But I ask for your forgiveness, not as a ruler, but as a man. And I promise you, I will not be the same emperor I was. I will lead with my heart, and I will be the leader you deserve." His words were simple, but they rang with truth. The emperor paused, his eyes sweeping over the court, the faces of his ministers and the faces of his people. He could see the hesitation in their eyes, the uncertainty that still lingered, but he also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a spark of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, he could rebuild their trust. The emperor finished his speech, standing tall but humbled, knowing that he had taken the first step toward redemption. He was no longer the emperor who lived behind a mask, the emperor who had obsessed over appearances. He was now the emperor who faced the truth, who sought to build a kingdom based not on grandeur, but on the true strength of character. The emperor stood at the center of his court, his heart still heavy with the weight of his confession, but now also filled with a new sense of clarity. His eyes, once focused solely on appearances, now saw his people with a deeper understanding. The ministers, the nobles, and the courtiers before him, who had once admired him for his outward grandeur, now looked at him with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. They had heard his words, his apology, his vow for change, and now they waited, as uncertain as he had once been. In the silence that followed, the emperor finally understood that true leadership was not about making grand speeches or displaying wealth. It wasn't about the crown on his head or the robes on his back. True leadership came from a willingness to acknowledge mistakes, to be vulnerable, and to build a future based on trust, compassion, and honesty. It was about showing his people that he too was human, and that he was ready to build something real, not something manufactured from vanity and falsehoods. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the faces of those in front of him. His voice, though softer than it had been before, carried an authority that was born not of fear or command, but of humility and truth. "I have been blind," he said, "blind to what truly matters. I see now that leadership is not about being revered from afar, not about being seen as perfect. It is about walking with my people, understanding their struggles, their joys, and their fears. I ask you all to walk with me, to help me rebuild this kingdom, not on illusions, but on truth. For a kingdom built on truth will be one that lasts, one that stands on a foundation of love and respect, not pride and deceit." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. It was not loud or overwhelming, but it was genuine, and it was the first real acknowledgement the emperor had received in a long time. He stood still, waiting, watching, feeling the weight of his words settle in the hearts of those before him. For the first time, he did not feel the need to rush, to demand, or to expect instant approval. He had made his peace, and now he needed to wait for the people to decide if they could trust him once again. Trust, he now understood, could not be restored through grand gestures or empty promises. It could only be restored through consistent action, through showing his people that he was more than just the clothes he wore, more than the throne he sat upon. He was just a man, like them, and he needed to prove that he could be a leader who truly cared. The air was thick with the uncertainty of what came next, but it was also filled with something else, something lighter, something new. The emperor felt a change within himself, like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. For the first time, he didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be the emperor of illusions. He just needed to be real. As he looked at his court, his ministers, his advisors, and the people who had once adored him, he felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. The truth, painful though it had been to confront, had freed him. The emperor was no longer bound by his vanity or his pride. He was free to be himself, to lead with authenticity, to be the emperor he had always wanted to be. not one who stood alone above everyone else, but one who stood with them, understanding them, growing with them. The emperor smiled, though it was a smile filled with vulnerability, not arrogance. He had finally found his place, not just as a ruler, but as a person. He could now walk alongside his people, not above them. "Let this be a new beginning," the emperor said, his voice soft but firm. "Let this be the beginning of a kingdom where truth is more valuable than gold, where honesty is more prized than appearances. Together we will rebuild, not just the palace, but the very fabric of our society." And as the emperor spoke, the court remained silent, but their silence was no longer filled with fear or uncertainty. It was a silence that acknowledged the change, that embraced the possibility of something real and lasting. For the first time, the emperor felt that he was leading a kingdom that could grow, not just in power, but in heart. And this, he knew, was the most important victory of all. The evening wore on, the candles flickering softly in the warm air, but the emperor felt a peace he had never known. His reign would no longer be defined by illusions. It would be defined by truth, humility, and love. The emperor had come full circle, and in doing so he had set the foundation for a new kind of rule, a rule that was no longer about appearance, but about genuine connection with his people.